The Battle of Stalingrad was a very important fight in World War II. It happened in a city called Stalingrad, which is now named Volgograd. This city is in Russia, right next to the long Volga River. The battle started in the summer of 1942 and ended in the winter of 1943. It was, honestly, one of the biggest and deadliest battles in all of human history. Millions of soldiers fought there and, well, many people died. This battle was not just about one city, it was about the future of the entire war. It marked a place where the powerful German army was finally stopped in its tracks. Adolf Hitler, the leader of Germany, had a big plan called Operation Blue. His goal was to capture the rich oil fields in the south of the Soviet Union in a region called the Caucasus. Oil was like blood for his war machine. His tanks, planes, and trucks all needed fuel to keep fighting. To protect the German soldiers moving south towards the oil, Hitler needed to secure their side, their flank. He saw the city of Stalingrad as a key point. Capturing it would block the Soviet Union from using the Volga River, a major route for supplies and troops, which would make the German army's path much safer. The city also had a special name. It was named after the Soviet leader, Joseph Stalin. For Hitler, taking a city named after his greatest enemy was a huge prize. It would be a massive propaganda victory, and a deep personal insult to Stalin. This made the battle more than just a military goal. It became a symbol. For Stalin, losing the city with his name was unthinkable. He ordered his soldiers to defend Stalingrad at any cost. So, both leaders poured huge numbers of soldiers and weapons into this one single place, making the fight incredibly intense and personal for both sides. The German Sixth Army, led by General Friedrich Paulus, was one of the best armies in the world. They had won many battles and seemed unstoppable as they marched towards Stalingrad in the hot summer of 1942. At first, their advance was very fast. The Soviet soldiers of the Red Army were pushed back again and again. The German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, bombed Stalingrad heavily. They turned most of the city into ruins, hoping to make it easier for their soldiers to take. But the piles of broken buildings would soon become a deadly trap for the attackers. When the German soldiers entered Stalingrad in September 1942, the battle changed completely. It was no longer a war of fast-moving tanks on open plains. It became a slow, brutal fight inside the city itself. This is called urban warfare. The Germans called it Rattenkrieg, which means rat war. Soldiers fought from building to building, room to room, and even in the dark sewers under the streets. A single ruined house or a broken factory could be a fortress. The fighting was so close that soldiers often used knives and shovels as weapons because there was no space to aim a rifle properly. The Soviet defenders, the 62nd Army led by General Vasily Chuikov, used the city's ruins to their advantage. They knew every broken wall and hidden cellar. Their plan was simple: hug the enemy. This meant staying as close to the German soldiers as possible. By doing this, they made it very difficult for the German Air Force to drop bombs without hitting their own men. Soviet snipers hid in the rubble, becoming famous for their skill. They would wait for hours, perfectly still, to take a single shot at a German officer or soldier, spreading fear among the invaders. Life for soldiers on both sides was a living nightmare. Food and clean water were very hard to find. The constant noise of explosions and gunfire never stopped, day or night. Soldiers lived in constant fear, never knowing when an attack might come. The fighting was focused on a few key places like a huge grain elevator, a tractor factory, and a hill called Mamayev Kurgan. This hill was especially important because whoever controlled it could see and shoot at the entire city. It changed hands many times, and the ground was covered with so many bombs and shells that the soil was full of metal. As autumn turned into the freezing Russian winter, the situation for the German soldiers became much worse. They were not prepared for the extreme cold. Their summer uniforms were too thin, and their machines often froze and stopped working. The Soviet soldiers, however, were used to the harsh weather and had warm clothing. The snow and ice made moving around the ruined city even more difficult for the Germans. The cold became another enemy, just as dangerous as the Soviet soldiers hiding in the rubble, slowly weakening the German army. While the German Sixth Army was trapped fighting inside Stalingrad, the Soviet generals were secretly planning a huge counterattack. The plan was called Operation Uranus. It was a very ambitious and clever idea. The Soviet leaders, including General Georgy Zhukov, saw that the German forces protecting the sides of the Sixth Army were much weaker. These were mostly Romanian, Hungarian and Italian soldiers who did not have the same powerful weapons or training as the Germans. The Soviet plan was to attack these weaker points, far to the north and south of the city itself. On November 19, 1942, the Soviets launched their massive surprise attack. Huge numbers of Soviet tanks and soldiers smashed through the weak Romanian lines. The weather was terrible, with thick fog and snow, which helped the Soviets hide their movements. The Romanian and other Allied soldiers were quickly overwhelmed and began to run. The Soviet forces moved very fast, like two giant arms reaching around the city. They did not attack Stalingrad directly. Instead, they went around it, aiming to meet each other far behind the German 6th Army. This kind of attack is called a pincer movement. Just 4 days later, on November 23rd, the two Soviet armies met at a town called Kalak, to the west of Stalingrad. The trap was closed. General Paulus and his entire 6th Army, more than 250,000 German soldiers, were now completely surrounded. They were cut off from all their supplies, food and ammunition. Hitler ordered Paulus not to try and break out of the circle. He promised that the German Air Force would fly in everything the army needed. This was called an airlift, but it was an impossible promise to keep in the middle of the Russian winter. The German Air Force tried its best, but it was a total failure. The Soviet Air Force and anti-aircraft guns shot down many German transport planes. The planes that did make it through could not carry nearly enough food or supplies for so many men. The soldiers inside the pocket, as the surrounded area was called, began to starve. They were freezing in the terrible cold, with little ammunition to fight and no medical supplies for the wounded. Their situation grew more desperate with each passing day, as the Red Army tightened its grip around them. Inside the surrounded pocket, the German 6th Army slowly fell apart during the terrible winter of 1942 to 1943. The soldiers were starving, freezing, and sick. They ate their horses, and then they had nothing. The promised airlift brought only a tiny fraction of what they needed to survive. A German attempt to break through the Soviet circle from the outside, called Operation Winter Storm, was defeated by the Red Army. All hope was lost for the trapped soldiers. The Soviets offered them a chance to surrender, but Hitler angrily forbade it, ordering them to fight to the last man. By January 1943, the Soviet army began its final attack to destroy the trapped Germans. They split the pocket into smaller and smaller pieces. The German soldiers were too weak from hunger and cold to fight effectively. On January 31, 1943, General Paulus, who Hitler had just promoted to Field Marshal, surrendered. Hitler had expected him to kill himself rather than be captured. A few days later, on February 2nd, the last of the German forces in Stalingrad gave up. Of the more than 250,000 men trapped, only about 91,000 were left to surrender. Most of them would die later in Soviet prison camps. The defeat at Stalingrad was a disaster for Nazi Germany. It was the first time that the German army had suffered such a huge and public loss. The myth of German invincibility was broken forever. The victory gave a massive boost to the morale of the Soviet people and soldiers, and to the Allied powers fighting Germany all over the world. From this point on, the German army would be mostly on the defensive on the Eastern Front. The Soviet Red Army began the long and difficult push west, which would eventually end in the capture of the German capital Berlin in 1945. The Battle of Stalingrad is remembered as the most important turning point of World War II in Europe. It stopped Hitler's advance into the Soviet Union and used up German men and machines that could never be replaced. The incredible sacrifice of the Soviet soldiers and civilians showed the world that Germany could be beaten. The battle changed the course of history, ensuring that the tide of the war would turn against the Axis powers. It was a brutal, terrible battle, but its outcome helped decide the fate of the world and led to the ultimate Allied victory.